Again, for those of you that don't have the program, Surgey, Center for Media and Democracy and PR Watch, the research director, I invite you to come up here and we kick off with that, and I ask you to join me in welcoming them.
Thanks everyone. It's good to be here. So I'm going to start off the evening by talking about an organisation that's having its annual meeting just a few miles away from here, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council. You'll see that its acronym is Alec, and I'm also going to be briefly talking about an organisation that is very much connected to Alec, which is called the State Policy Network. Brett Connor's going to give you a lot more detail on that and really explain how that organisation works, but I'm going to talk some about that. I'm just going to put a timer on to make sure that I don't talk at you for the next hour. Yeah, Rick's going to make sure of that. Okay, so briefly before I do that, my organisation, the Centre for Media and Democracy, which actually recently merged with the Progressive magazine. Many of you will know Progressive magazine's been around now for more than 100 years. It's based in Madison, Wisconsin. The Center for Media and Democracy, also based in Madison. And we merged a couple of months ago. And we do a lot of tracking of Alec. We have a site called PR Watch. We have another one called Alec Exposed. If you want to get more information on Alec and some other sources that I'm going to give you in a couple of minutes, those are two great starting points. We published about 5 articles on Alec this week already, more to come. We track Alec across the country. We file public records requests. We do on-the-ground research, including what I'm doing, some of what I'm doing, other than being here down in Dallas this week. We look at lobbying disclosures, legislative records, trying to identify where Alec bills get introduced. I'll explain what that means in a couple of minutes. We look through archives, look through tax filings, talk to people, and that's been going on for the last 3 years. So what is Alec? You have some of the Alec corporate funders there. Alec was founded in 1973, so it's been around for more than 40 years. And it was founded by Paul Weyrich, who also founded a number of other organizations on the right, including the Heritage Foundation, focused on the family. And he was very much involved in the early 1970s in trying to follow the ideas in the Powell memo. Lewis Powell, who then became a Supreme Court justice, laid out this memo where he said that the right is really losing to groups on the left, the progressive groups, who have all this infrastructure, and we need to invest in legal infrastructure, try and get judges elected, we need to build all these state-based national think tanks. So that was the plan, and Alec was there at the forefront of that 41 years ago. It's evolved somewhat over the years, but it's now predominantly funded by large corporations and foundations that are linked to other corporations. And so those are foundations like the family foundations of Koch brothers, and there are others. And they exist to promote a legislative agenda. So Alec has model bills, and that's what they do. That's what they're doing just a few miles away. They're now voting on new model bills, and I think Representative Taylor from Wisconsin is going to talk a little bit about some of this. And Alec has somewhere in the region of about 800 model bills. They cull some from time to time. They decide that it's no longer important. That often happens when particular corporations stop funding Alec, and so for quite a number of years Alec was proposing legislation that was essentially going to lock more people up. And they were funded, they received money from the Corrections Corporation of America for a time, GEO Group, the 2 leading private prison companies in the US. They stopped funding them. Coincidentally or not, Alec stopped promoting that legislation. It's now shifted to equally profitable alternatives to incarceration. So they work on a range of issues: environment, privatizing education, lowering taxes, particularly lowering taxes for rich people and obviously corporations. They meet 3 times a year. They're meeting now. Obviously, they'll have another meeting in December, which is happening in DC, and then they have a smaller meeting in the spring. At each of those meetings, they're developing, voting on model legislation. They're very, very secretive. They've been somewhat forced into the open over the last few years, but they still remain very, very secretive. And they lobby. They claim they don't lobby. They do lobby. There's ample evidence. If Jay is going to talk about this, Common Cause has a complaint that they filed with the IRS. Incidentally, I should admit, I used to work for Common Cause. So I worked on that before I joined the CMD. there's ample evidence that Alec engages in lobbying activities. So they've somewhat become warped from the original intent if you believe what they originally were, and I've spoken to the original executive director back in 1973. She's in her 90s now. And she was actually, instead, she claims, we don't have the court records because they were destroyed, but she claims that she was fired for being a woman. She received a letter, according to her side of the story, that said, we need to move this organization to Washington, D.C. They just received a large check, $75,000 from the Scaife Foundation, and we need a man to head this organization. She sued, she won a year's salary. She certainly did win a year's salary, that's a matter of record. But Alec claimed that they originally created in order to allow like-minded legislators, conservative-leaning, right-leaning, like-minded legislators to share bills, share good ideas. And that idea actually undermines lobbyists, because if a legislator, particularly in the pre-internet age, if a legislator wants to get a copy of a bill, they want to find a good idea, and they can't get it from each other, then they're going to get it from a lobbyist, particularly when they have very, very little staff. So that's the idea. It's sort of a good idea, and there are some groups on the left that are trying to do a similar kind of idea. There's one called Alice, which is also based in Madison, Wisconsin. But Alec doesn't do that. Alec is much more involved. It promotes an agenda. It allows corporations to dictate not only the issues that they work on, but the actual language of the bills that they promote. So, for example, they've been pushing school vouchers and right to work for 30 years. A lot of talk about right to work. In the last few years, Alec has been behind that since the early 1980s. They claim to have 2,000 legislative members. The reason I put a couple of question marks on the end there is that that is not true. They claimed that for a very long time, and then at the end of November, The Guardian released a whole number of internal Alec documents which showed that they had been substantially overstating the number of legislators that they have, not only publicly, but also to their corporate funders. And they've been losing a lot of money. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But they still have about 1,800, and that's about a quarter of all state legislators in the entire country as members. And when you consider that almost all of those legislative members are from one party, the Republican Party, that means that they've got a huge amount of influence over the Republican Party. And they particularly target leadership within each of those state houses. Alec, there's been all of this work that we've been doing to expose them. I'll come on to that in a moment. Even Alec has now admitted that its brand has become toxic. And so their head of public relations sent an email to their legislative members across the country. We got hold of a copy of this through a public records request. He bemoaned the fact that they now had this reputation. He thought it was unfair, but he wrote that they were now being perceived as a, quote, distant, mysterious Washington alphabet organization of unknown intentions, which is fairly accurate. But he wouldn't agree. So they organize around issue areas. I mentioned education, environment, tax, and there's 9 in total. They have public and private sector members, very cheap to join if you're a legislator. You're entitled to all sorts of these corporate-funded scholarships. Much more expensive to join if you're a corporation. So it's $50 a year to join if you're a legislator. Many of the legislators don't even pay that. They claim it back from the state or use campaign funds. If you're a corporation, it costs around about $10,000 if you want to be a member and join a task force, and you really want to join a task force because that's how you're going to get your agenda pushed through. And it can cost up to $25,000 just to be a member and then additional fees. And many of the corporations also sponsor conferences and in other ways support the organization financially. They have these issue alerts, which are really examples of lobbying. When they want a legislator to introduce a particular bill that is an Alec bill, they send these alerts out. They claim that's not lobbying, incidentally. They claim that that is education. And that's because Alec is a charity. It's a 501c3 organization. They can lobby, but they can't do very much by law. And they consistently tell the IRS that they do $0 worth of lobbying, and this is the IRS submission that Common Cause has submitted. So they carry that theme through. They're an educational organization, and so they don't lobby legislators, they educate them. When they pay for, or have corporations pay for their trips to their conferences, that's a scholarship. When they have these trips that they organize, sometimes in order to really drill legislators on a particular issue, those are called academies. All of these things come with a price. An academy incidentally costs $70,000. Keystone, there's a Keystone Academy up in Alberta a couple of years ago. That was sponsored by, you can probably guess if you know anything about the Keystone Pipeline, that was sponsored by TransCanada, and all of the legislators who reported all of the expenses, all of the gifts that they'd received, they didn't write TransCanada, they wrote Alec. And that's another way that Alec sort of hides the influence of these corporations. And as it says at the bottom, everything has a price. And we have that price list actually, which Connor got hold of and is up on the Alec Exposed website. So in 2011, a whistleblower came to the Center for Media and Democracy, and they had all of the model bills, all of the language for each of those bills, including bills like voter ID, stand your ground, the language in SB 1070 in Arizona, and many others, 800 model bills. And Alec had keeping all of those secret for decades. And they were put up online on the Alec Exposed website. And since then, it says 300. I really do need to update that because we've now written more than 600 articles about Alec in the last 3 years. We've written a whole number of state reports, partnering with other organizations, including Common Cause, People for the American Way, Progress Now, Greenpeace, Color of Change, who had this very successful campaign in order to try and tell corporations that it was unacceptable to try and market to African Americans publicly and then privately try to take away their right to vote. More than 60 corporations have left Alec in the last 3 years. Been a whole range of, I'm going to have to go through this quickly, but the New York Times, MSNBC, Guardian, great story in the Guardian yesterday, and there's been way more than 1,000 stories in the last 3 years. I'm going to show you a couple of quick clips, and then I'm going to have to close out.
This week from Borders and Company, privatizing America, one state house at a time.
Through Alec, you can change the whole country without ever going to Washington, without ever having to go through a congressional hearing, without ever having to lobby at Capitol Hill, without ever having to talk to the president.
The United States of Alec.
So I have 12 minutes, but Bill Moyers did a 50-minute documentary on Alec. First in 2012, and then he did an updated version in 2013. And so that is a great way to find out more about Alec if you'd like to. And there's one more clip that I'm going to show, which is Paul Weyrich, who I said was the founder of Alec back in 1973. Here's what he said about voting. And remember, Alec promotes voter ID legislation.
Now, many of our Christians have what I call the goo-goo syndrome. Good government. They want everybody to vote. I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, on television, the elections quite candidly goes up as the voting populace goes down.
So that's very transparent. And of course, he was saying that at a time when we don't have the internet. I think a lot of politicians now are so savvy about knowing that someone's going to capture that on an iPhone or something and put it online. That was obviously not the case back in the day with Paul Weyrich. Very, very honest. I'm just going to quickly mention the State Policy Network, and then maybe we'll get into some of the rest of the things I'd like to tell you about Alec in the discussion. State Policy Network is a network of right-wing think tanks. Same kind of origin in terms of the Powell memo, trying to create this whole network of infrastructure for the right so that they can push their agenda through. Alec has a budget of about $8 million. State Policy Network has a budget of $83 million. There are 2 State Policy Network think tanks, $83 million, so more than 10 times the amount. Network, think tanks in every single state, 2 in Texas, hugely influential. They provide the kind of seemingly academic justification for all of the legislation that Alec then promotes. Connor's going to tell you much more about how they work, and so I'm going to save all of the horrible information about the State Policy Network. That's me.